Prabhupada, 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 Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki Nitai Gaura Premananda. All glory to the assembled devotees. All glory to the assembled devotees. All glory to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Continued readings from Srimad Bhagvatam, 6th Canto, Chapter 1, Text 41. Yena svadham nyami bhava rajasattva tamo maya gunanama kriya rupar vipavyante yata tatam. Yena swadham niyami bhava raja sattva tamo maya guna nama kriya rupar bhavyante yata tatam. Yena swadham niyami bhava raja sattva tamo maya Gunanama Kriya Rupar Vayante Tatatam. Translation, I'll do word to word. Yena, by whom, Narayan, Swadhamni, although in his own place, the spiritual world, Ami, all of these, Bhava, manifestations, Raja, Sattvatama, Maya, created by the three modes of material nature, passion, goodness, and ignorance. Guna, qualities. Nama, names. Kriya, activities. Rupai, with forms. Vibhavyate, are variously manifested. Yatatatam, exactly to the right point. Translation purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: the supreme cause of all causes, Narayan, is situated in his own abode in the spiritual world. But nevertheless, he controls the entire cosmic manifestation according to the three modes of material nature: Sattvaguna, Rajoguna, and Tamoguna. In this way, all living entities are awarded different qualities, different names, such as Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, different duties according to the Varnashram institution, and different forms. Thus, Narayan is the cause of the entire cosmic manifestation. Purport: the Vedas inform us Translation: Narayan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is almighty, omnipotent. He has multifarious energies, and therefore he is able to remain in his own abode and without endeavor supervise and manipulate the entire cosmic manifestation through the interaction of the three modes of material nature, Sattva-guna, Rajaguna, and Tamaguna. These interactions create different forms, bodies, activities, and changes, which all occur perfectly. Because the Lord is perfect, everything works as if he were directly supervising and taking part in it. Atheistic men, however, being covered by the three modes of material nature, cannot see Narayan to be the supreme cause behind all activities. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Tribhir gunamair bhavair ebhi sarvam idam jagat mohitam napijanati mamebhya paramavyayam. Deluded by the three modes, the whole world does not know me, who am above the modes and inexhaustible. Because unintelligent agnostics are mohita, illusioned by the three modes of material nature, they cannot understand that Narayan Krishna is the supreme cause of all activities. As stated in Brahma Samhita, Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha Anadir Adir Govinda Sarva Karana Karanam. Krishna, who is known as Govinda, is the supreme controller. He has an eternal blissful spiritual body. He is the origin of all. He has no other origin, for he is the prime cause of all causes. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapatantikam Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindubhya Evacha Patitanan Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So this verse is describing the superintendence of Krishna through, although he's aloof in the spiritual world, he's directly maintaining everything through the modes of material nature. Now this is actually the answers that the Yamadutas are giving from the Vishnudutas. The Vishnudutas have asked a few questions, and now we're hearing the answers here. They asked, explain the meaning of religious principles and the symptoms of irreligion. What is the process of punishing others? Who's actually fit for punishment? And are all karmis engaged in fruitive activities suitable for punishment, or only some of them? So, yesterday's verse we were beginning the answers. That actually what is real religion and what is real irreligion? It's that which comes from the Vedas. The principles of Dharma, the purport mentioned, they're not actually manufactured by Narayan, but they're actually emanate from him. So eternally, these principles are the same, just as the cosmic manifestation manifests and absorbs and retracts. Similarly, the principles of Dharma are eternally existing. And as we're seeing here, the Yamadutas, they are not unintelligent. They're not just robots. They have very deep understanding, and they're practically Krishna conscious. I don't know specifically, but they're explaining how everything is working under Lord Narayan. They have direct perception because their job is to actually arrest those who violate the injunctions of Dharma. So the purport is mentioning the nature of how these modes are actually perfectly governing everything in the material world. I found this text helpful because sometimes I've wondered, in other words, we know that the modes of nature is what's responsible for the activity in this world, the interaction of the modes, and the modes are always competing for supremacy. But I always kind of wondered about the modes. Why are there three modes? Why are they always competing? It's just something that we accept, we hear about in Bhagavad Gita. But here we're actually hearing that he controls the entire cosmic manifestation through these modes. So these modes are actually a manifestation of Krishna's control of this material world, and it's a very perfect order. Because of the different natures of the desires of living entities, they come under the control of these modes in order to enact their propensities, their perverted desires. So this is Krishna's system, actually, to keep all living entities in the material world engaged, and that includes different qualities that they may arrive, different names, in other words, different social positions, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, different duties, and different forms. So through these modes of nature, actually, Krishna is perfectly maintaining everything. We understand that material energy is inauspicious for those of us who are trying to get out of it. But actually, we can see that it's performing a great service by keeping living entities properly engaged according to their desire. It's a service in one sense. And it's mentioned that because the Lord is perfect, everything works as if he were perfectly supervising and take part in it. So even though Krishna is enjoying himself in the spiritual world, through his different energies, actually, everything is working so perfectly that it's as though he's right there. And that's what we'll also hear about in the next few texts. Unfortunately, the modes are so covering that we're not able to perceive Krishna. Oftentimes, the only thing that in material sense we are conscious of is the effects of the modes of nature. So, therefore, this 14th chapter of Gita is particularly glorified because this is giving one the opportunity to actually understand Krishna. That until one gets free from the grips of the modes of nature, they won't actually be able to understand this middle section of the Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, the middle section, describes the process of bhakti. But before we can really engage in that, we have to understand how the modes are working and how we can get out of them. And the key that Krishna mentions throughout that is that one has to actually be neutral and transcendental to the modes of nature. Despite the influences of passion, goodness, and ignorance, if one remains engaged in devotional service despite these fluctuations, then one can transcend the modes. So one has to observe them, one has to be very conscious in our day-to-day activity. This is what Krishna says, only by hearing about these modes of nature from a self-realized soul. So by hearing about the modes of nature in Bhagavad Gita, then we actually can edify our intelligence to observe their interactions. Until we carefully try to understand how the modes are acting, we'll always be under their influence. You're prisoned by something if you don't know. Just like a misconception, you're stuck in that prison of that misconception until you can realize what it is. So the modes of nature, until you realize how they're acting upon us, then we're always under their influence. So therefore Krishna says, you have to carefully observe how these modes are operating, and in that way you can get free from them. So this is obviously a principle that's understood by the Yamadutas, and I don't have so much to comment. The purport is kind of straightforward, so I was going to continue that also. This is text 42. This is the answers by the Yamadutas. They continue. The sun, fire, sky, air, demigods, moon, evening, day, night, directions, water, land, and Supersoul himself all witness the actions of the living entity. Purport: the members of some religious sects, especially Christians, do not believe in the reactions of karma. We once had a discussion with a learned Christian professor who argued that although people are generally punished after the witnesses of their misdeeds are examined, where the witness is responsible for one's suffering the reactions of past karma. To such a person, the answer by the Yamadutas is given here. A conditioned soul thinks that he is working stealthily and that no one can see his sinful activities. But we can understand from the Shastras that there are many witnesses, including the sun, fire, sky, air, moon, demigods, evening, day, night, directions, water, land, and the Supersoul himself, who sits with the individual soul within his heart. Where is the dearth of witnesses? The witnesses and the Supreme Lord both exist, and therefore so many living entities are elevated to higher planetary systems or degraded to lower planetary systems including the hellish planets. There are no discrepancies, for everything is arranged perfectly by the management of the Supreme God. Swabhavaki Jana Gyana Balakriyacha. The witnesses mentioned in this verse are also mentioned in other Vedic literatures and in other Sanskrit verses given. So, yes, no one can avoid actually the government of the Supreme Lord. In the material world, if someone's very expert, they can avoid punishment. They can secretly perform crimes. You can print out counterfeit money from your own printer. You can do things like that. And you may not get caught. But in the government of the Supreme Lord, actually, nothing goes unnoticed. The laws of material nature are very stringent. There's, I think, a Greek saying in philosophy that the wheels of the gods grind thin and fine, something like that. That you can't escape the system of justice that Krishna has set up because there's so many witnesses, and at every moment we're being observed actually how we're acting. So this is just an impetus to be very careful that at any moment, often we think, okay, I'm alone, my authority's not watching, the Vaishnavas are not here, but here we're hearing so many witnesses are there, so to always be careful. And the idea also that we'll hear in this discussion is that actually so many people are guilty in this material world because of these modes of nature. So it's a really nice dialogue here. I wanted to go into the next text as well, text 43. The answers go until about text 45, so that because the purports are quite short, we may make it there. The candidates, text 43, the candidates for punishment are those who are confirmed by these many witnesses to have deviated from their prescribed regulative duties. Everyone engaged in fruitive activities is suitable to be subjected to punishment according to his sinful acts. So if one derives from their prescribed regulative duties, they're suitable for punishment. And everyone engaged in fruitive activities is also awaiting punishment. No purport. Text 44. O inhabitants of Vaikuntha, you are sinless, but those within this material world are all karmis, whether acting piously or impiously. Both kinds of action are possible for them because they are contaminated by the three modes of nature and must act accordingly. One who has accepted a material body cannot be inactive, and sinful action is inevitable for one acting under the modes of material nature. Therefore, all the living entities within this material world are punishable. Purport: the difference between human beings and non-human beings is that a human is supposed to act according to the direction of the Vedas. Unfortunately, men manufacture their own ways of acting without reference to the Vedas. Therefore, all of them commit sinful actions and are punishable. So the idea here is that just by being in this material world, one is forced to engage in punishable activity. Unless one's fully transcendental to their existence in the material manifestation, then they're bound even piously or impiously. They're implicated because they're contaminated by the three modes of material nature and must act accordingly. So we mentioned anyone who's in this material world, they're forced to act under the direction of these modes of nature, even in the mode of goodness, which is considered in the material categorization the highest quality of being. It's simply further bondage, actually, and it's punishable because one is still engaged in fruitive activity. What to speak of the lower modes of nation, passion, ignorance, impious activity, even pious activity, one is suitable for punishment because they have to get the reactions for that work. They have to maintain in this cycle of birth and death. Therefore, the Yamadus are saying, one who's accepted a material body, he can't be inactive, so therefore he has to engage in some type of sinful activity because he's under the modes of nature. So sometimes we think that we're not in this position, that I'm free from this situation, but actually if we're still under the modes of nature, then it's mentioned we're still committing sinful activity. Unfortunately, in bhakti, we are operating under a different operative principle of mercy, the mercy of the Guru, spiritual master, the Vaishnavas, and Krishna. So we're not held to such a strict standard as those who do not take up the process of bhakti. But even ourselves, if we're performing activity under the modes of nature, it can be considered sinful in the sense that we're still acting contrary to the Lord's desire. If we're not fully surrendered, then we're still actually operating under what generally would be considered a punishable activity. So therefore, all living entities, they're saying, are actually punishable. So the Yamadus have a lot of work to do in the material world, because everyone is punishable, no one can escape. Unless one surrenders, unless one takes full shelter of the spiritual energy. And in the Vedas it's mentioned that by acting according to the Vedas, this is the distinction of human life. So if one is not cognizant and understanding the purport of the Vedas, then they're committing sinful activities. And the final text. In proportion to the extent of one's religious or irreligious actions in this life, one must enjoy or suffer the corresponding reactions of his karma in the next. Purport, as stated in Bhagavad Gita 14:18, Urdhvam gachanti sattvashta madhye tishtanti rajasa jaghanya gunavrittishta adho gachanti tamasaha. Those who act in the mode of goodness are promoted to higher planetary systems to become demigods. Those who act in an ordinary way and do not commit excessively sinful acts remain within this middle planetary system, and those who perform abominable sinful actions must go down to hellish life. So this whole discussion is going to, and is really, this chapter is highlighting actually the unique position of the process of bhakti. How everyone is implicated in this material world, in whatever quality of nature they're situated. And therefore the only way one can get free from that is by taking up the process of bhakti, of devotional service, and only by carefully understanding the modes of nature. And the conclusion of this 14th chapter, where Krishna describes modes of nature, is Mam cha yo vyabhicharina bhakti yogena sevate sangunan samatityetan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. By this unfailing execution of devotional service in all circumstances of life, one actually transcends these modes of nature that are keeping us implicated, that are directing us contrary to the will of God, the modes of nature. So by this unhesitating, unfailing devotional service in all circumstances. When we do some devotional service, then we stop, we have a break period, and then we take it up again. This is keeping us in material. To really transcend, we have to strive for this unfailing, just a continuous cycle. In the Bhagvatam is described as a hoitukiya pratiyata. It's like a train that generates momentum. That once we get some momentum, we keep going. Then if there's a small obstruction in the track, the train can keep going. It won't be caught up. Versus if it's stopping and starting, then the momentum is not sufficient. It will get stopped or derailed. There's so many issues. So this is what the section is highlighting, that through the process of bhakti, actually, one gets free from the messengers of Yamaraj, the Yamadutas. They actually have no position to implicate one who's taken shelter of devotional service in the internal energy, and that person becomes free from the modes of nature and is able to ultimately fully surrender to Krishna and thereby act in complete harmony with the Lord's desire at every moment. So this is the goal that we strive for. So, just in reading this this section that we're at now, I just was really appreciating their response here, and I felt it would be easier to understand this one text just in context. So thank you all very much. Maybe we can discuss, there's some interesting points here about the implications in the material world. Raktak? Yeah, Hare Krishna. Well, he is considered a Mahajan. A Mahajan, like a very exalted, pure devotee.
So the Yamadutas are demons, or what are they?
What would you say? The order carriers of Yamaraj.
So
They have a
either-
particular service.
So they're not demons, and they're not.
They're serving a pure devotee because Yamaraj is a pure devotee. They do have ghastly features, but they're doing service. I believe
They're devotees too. Then.
I asked Himanshu about this, and he mentioned that Bhaktividya Purnamaraj gave a whole class on how one can, because I was also thinking one can take this position. How does one receive the position of becoming a Yamaduta, that type of service? And so he said Bhaktividya Purnamaraj gave a whole class on that, but I didn't get the details of how that happens, or I can't comment so much. We can just see by their activities what they're doing, and they have to punish others. So in one sense, that's a service. It's a service, Jaya.
Years in the dreadful hell and have no descendants to offer gifts, and their favor become messengers of Yama. This is from the Garuda Purana. Those who have passed several years in the dreadful hell and have no descendants to offer gifts in their favor become messengers of Yama. I can do some more research, but that's one step.
Yeah. It's a difficult position, I would think. Anything else? Any other questions or comments? The modes of nature, questions, answers here.
It's interesting because the Vishnu Dutas inquired, what is the basis by which one understands who is punishable, who is not punishable, what is the scope of punishment, how severe is, and so on. They ask all these questions. And the Yamadutas are giving answers which are very much edified in terms of the modes of nature. But what's interesting is that they haven't mentioned anything about transcendental principles in their answers. So that's kind of what the Vishnudutas were looking for. And although they had knowledge of the modes of material nature, because they were devoid of proper understanding of principles of transcendence, then they made a mistake in their judgment of Ajamil. And so, as you also pointed this out in your discussion, that this pastime is indirectly highlighting the glories of transcendental principles, particularly those of devotional service, because they're not giving any transcendental understanding. So, in other words, just having knowledge of the modes alone is not transcendental understanding. It's helpful in order to understand how to navigate the material world, how to discriminate between various things that are taking place in our psychology and in the physical world. But that knowledge alone is not transcendental. It's not sufficient to act transcendentally either. You need transcendental principles are of another category.
Yeah, they do recognize the position of Narayan himself,
But
that
so do
he's
the
transcendental.
karmis who don't worship Narayana for devotional reasons or spiritual reasons. They recognize him as the order supplier. So the Yamadutas don't speak of Narayana in terms of his transcendence. They just speak of him in terms of the controller of the material world. The Vedas are coming from him. We've heard this from Yamaraj. But they don't speak of, like worshiping Narayana, how that frees one from this and from the material contamination and so on. So the karmis also have information on Narayana without understanding his transcendence. And so also do persons who worship the devatas. They know of Narayana also, but they see him as one of the various devatas you can worship. So Krishna says, for that reason, he says, not to nabijananti, tate netash chavyanti te. For that reason, they not knowing my position of transcendence, then they continue in samsara. Aham hi sarva yagnanam bhokta cha prabhu cha. You know this verse?
Yeah.
What is it? Natum
mam
name tu
nabijanati
abhijananti tatve
tatvena
netash chavanti
chavantite.
te. So why do they remain in samsara? Because they don't know my position of transcendence. So Yamadutas also don't understand that. So they haven't mentioned anything about transcendental principles. They're just telling what is going on in the material world. So that's not sufficient to come to proper conclusions. So also when we're evaluating things, that's what makes things hard to evaluate in the context of devotees. Let's say like how to deal with devotees or so on, because they are chanting Hare Krishna. And we have information of these transcendental principles, but then they're breaking something on a social level.
Difficult.
And then how do you reconcile the situation? Because on the one hand, especially like an institution, you got to set up a proper example.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you act too harshly and so on, it can be an offense because they have taken to chanting Hare Krishna
Exalted souls.
and so on. So it becomes difficult to navigate what is really the conclusive action to take in the case of like devotees who do take up Krishna consciousness. And so the Yamadusas also made such a mistake in the case of Arjuna.
Yeah, that these answers were insufficient. The Vishnudutas have to contribute the actual spiritual principles. So this is really nice that their answers were not. This is how they made the mistake, you know. But I understand, as you mentioned yesterday, that this was kind of like a event, like something that was arranged, because generally this doesn't happen. Generally, if one is engaged in bhakti, then the Yamadutas don't come. So then generally they would have, or Yamaraj just doesn't send them. Okay. Jai. Prabhuji.
I don't know how to frame the question, but its question is regarding its continuation of Jaya's question. Let's say we have joined Hare Krishna movement. We are trying to chant. Daily we are trying to compete with the three modes of nature. We are creating so many offenses, so many offenses. But whom should we depend on? Actually, it's depend upon the Krishna who will try to get out of this mode of nature, and it's also depend upon the degree of our surrender that he can help us to get out of the nature, or every day we do the mistake and every day we come in front of deities and say, Krishna, please help me, please help me. So it subdues every day, or it continues according to our degree of our surrender. To what extent the Krishna will help us.
On the degree of your submission to the Guru, that we have our conditioned nature, which is actually very difficult to change. In the material world, people, aside from like devotees in Krishna consciousness, people don't really change too much in material life. They may have some alterations, but it's very difficult to change someone's nature. But as soon as you start engaging in devotional service, you could transform so much. That's the power of devotion. Prabhupada would always remark how amazing it is that all of these Westerners are taking very carefully, following the principles. He said, this is my magic. So by the influence of the pure devotee, of the spiritual master, to the degree that we align ourselves and engage in his service, then to that degree actually we can experience genuine and permanent transformation. So it's a process of aligning ourselves with the internal energy which comes through the spiritual master. Now, of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but the potency is there, that it can happen very rapidly, as we see also in the early days of our movement. Very, very quickly, devotees came to exalt very high levels of devotional service because they were very carefully and very strictly engaged in the devotional service of their spiritual master. So that relationship has sufficient potency to transform our conditioned nature very easily. So to the degree that we can access that, then that change can happen. But we do make mistakes, and we do have, well, some of us have quite abominable conditioned natures. So there's a lot that we have to deal with. So coming before the deities on a daily basis to pray for help and courage and strength. This was one of the messages last night. Just take shelter of the Lord, of Lord Ram, and pray for courage. That on our own we can't do it, but if we pray for the strength, this is the essence of, or the idea behind praying to Lord Balaram for the spiritual strength to actually do, even though it's beyond my nature. When we make that humble appeal, the Lord will empower us to overcome our nature. And staying in the association of devotees, following the program, the regular principles, all these things will assist to change that nature. And if continually done, Rupa Goswami says, with utsahan nischaya dharya, enthusiasm, patience, and confidence, then guaranteed one will reap the benefit, one will reach the goal. So that's the formula. It's like a math formula. If you do these things, one is sure to develop actually pure love for God. So you have to stick with the program. The obstacle is when people give up, or they don't think I can't make it, or whatever reason. But the formula is there, and those who stick to it, all of the exalted devotees in our movement, Prabhupada disciples, they just stuck with it. And then, so they're okay. So they're free from their conditioned natures. They're going back to Godhead. So that's just what came to mind first. There's a lot of ways one could answer that, but by the influence of the Guru, the potency is there. Anyone else can share anything else?
That's a question, but I'm wanting to entertain maybe some discussion on the idea of changing our nature.
Okay.
Because sometimes I think we may misunderstand that, like we have to be someone else than what we exactly are. What makes our nature conditioned is that it's not for Krishna. But then if you offer that nature to Krishna, there's nothing wrong with it as such. It's not like just the nature itself is intrinsically bad. Krishna says that to see it separate from me, that is Maya. So it's not that there's something wrong with nature, therefore the Upanishad says everything is perfect. It's not that there's something's wrong with the nature per se, it's that we don't see it in relationship to Krishna. So like an apple by itself is bhoga, but the apple offered to Krishna is prasadam.
Mm-hmm.
But the apple doesn't change form, nothing really is transformed as such, but it's connected to Krishna, and now it assumes a transcendental feature. So similarly with our nature, we say change our nature, but what do we really mean by that? Because even in the case of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, it's not like their natures really changed. They offered it in surrender to Prabhupada, but Tamal Krishna was still Tamal Krishna,
Mm-hmm.
Vishnu Jan was still Vishnu Jan. They still had their particular sort of psychologies and mentalities and moods and ways of doing things, but it was offered to Krishna, and then it has a transcendental effect.
I definitely agree with that, but I think also that in the case of our conditioned nature, by nature it's antagonistic to Krishna. The nature of being envious or demoniac psychology, that type of nature has to be changed. Now it's changed in the sense that it's just properly engaged in service, but I guess I was referring to that type of nature that's opposed to the service of God. That's the Western, or the material tendency, the psychology, is to imitate God. So that part of the psychology has to be changed, right?
So yeah, right. That's what I'm also saying. But it's not Arjuna didn't become something else. He was still a Kshatriya.
Mm.
Someone will still be a Brahmana. So we will still have our personalities as they are, even if the conditioned aspects of them, the material aspects of them. But then if we offer that to Krishna, then it's not like it's inherently wrong. It's that it's not offered to Krishna that makes it binding to the material world. So someone, like you're saying, Guru Nama Kriya Rupa here, from the modes of nature, one has certain qualities that come up, and then gets a certain name like Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. According to that, there's certain kriya that takes place, activities, rupas there. And then, so these are all produced by the modes of material nature. So then it's just the modes of material nature, but then when you offer it to Krishna, it's not exactly that the gunas and the nama and all these things exactly change.
Mhm.
It's in light of sometimes we hear you have to change your nature, and it just makes us really uncomfortable with what we are in this life. But what we should be uncomfortable with is our antagonism towards Krishna. But not exactly that there's something wrong with me. Oh, I'm a woman, I'm a man, or I'm black. I have to change that. You know.
Mhm. Mm. 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 Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking how on another level, as the soul is a pure, the jiva, he's by nature a pure devotee. So in that sense, to think I have to change myself on the wrong platform. Rather, I have to recover my true identity.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Hello?
I think you can just shut it off. We can hear you. Okay. Hmm. Yeah, that's a nice point that's mentioned. Because also, this point is analyzed on two sides. That on one side, you can't surrender unless you're free from sinful activity. But 1866, he says, Masucha, don't worry. I'll save you from the sinful reactions. And Prabhupada mentions in Prabhupada, sometimes there's a question how one can surrender if they still have the influence of sinful activities. But Krishna says, don't worry. So that's a nice point. I know there's different ways of understanding that, two ways of seeing it. That's also there. Care what they have and protect what they lack. Yeah, for the surrendered devotee, Krishna takes full charge. Yeah, that's really such an amazing verse because that's what is really the solution to all these issues in the material world and being contaminated by modes of nature, etc. That one doesn't accept this principle. That Krishna will provide everything that we need. Okay, anything else? No, okay. Thank you all very much. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.